Hey, what's going on, gang? This is Nate on the Stone. Welcome back to my channel. And today we are talking about how the culture is actually coming after minorities. But it's not through systematic racism, the patriarchy, or any of the other usual suspects that we've been told about. I've talked before here on the Stone how I hate the term historical moment, especially when it's used to describe contemporary events. 9 out of 10 times, it acts more as just an ego booster to convince people today that we're just as good as past generations, never mind our actual accomplishments. And when it's not being used that way, it's often being employed as a shield to ward off any criticism, like we saw so many times when President Obama was in the White House. But sometimes, occasionally, historic moment is an actual accurate description of some event or some person, like it is with Ronald Sullivan Jr.
Who dat?
Sullivan is a lawyer of high repute who has handled a number of high-profile cases. He was part of Bill Clinton's defense team during the Paula Jones case. He represented Michael Brown's family after Brown was shot and killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And he was the lead prosecutor when former Missouri Governor Eric Greitens' case was going through the court system. And then in 2009, he was made the housemaster, later faculty dean when housemaster was considered offensive, slavery and all that, at the Winthrop House, a student dorm at Harvard. The historic moment aspect of this came from the fact that Sullivan was the very first African-American faculty dean in Harvard's 300-plus year history. And then Harvard decided not to renew his term as faculty dean, and Sullivan and his wife, Stephanie Robinson, left Harvard's campus on June 30th. The reason for this? In January, it was reported in the New York Post that Sullivan had actually become part of Harvey Weinstein's defense team, Weinstein being the former Hollywood mogul and producer who is now being prosecuted on charges of rape, sexual misconduct, and criminal sex acts after being accused of these crimes by 75 women, an event that actually led to the Me Too movement getting off the ground. When this story broke, Harvard students were outraged. The Association of Black Harvard Women actually wrote an email to Harvard administrators demanding that Sullivan resign, saying, quote, "You have failed the black women in this community, not only as one of the few black faculty deans on campus, but also as a community leader, someone who we respected and looked to for guidance." Buildings were vandalized with graffitied messages reading, "Your silence is violence. Whose side are you on? Our rage is self-defense." Dean Rakesh Khurana actually ordered a climate review of Winthrop House, a review that was later used as part of the justification for not renewing Sullivan's term as faculty dean of the student dorm, but which, curiously enough, was never actually made public. And it wasn't just Harvard students. Over at the New Republic, Lucy Caldwell penned a piece entitled "Why Harvard Was Right to Fire Ron Sullivan." In it, Caldwell argued that Sullivan had actually betrayed his quote-unquote pastoral duties as faculty dean when he became part of Weinstein's defense team, since the two jobs were mutually exclusive, since by becoming part of Weinstein's defense team, Sullivan made himself part of the system that had actually protected Weinstein for so many years from justice. This might smack of cognitive dissonance here because not believing Jussie Smollett's cock and bull story about being attacked in Chicago on the coldest night of the year, that's racist. Criticizing black players who take a knee during the national anthem, that's racist. Hell, giving a freshman congresswoman seats on important committees can now be interpreted as being racist. So what are we going to call Harvard firing its first African-American faculty dean? But ideologues don't see what Harvard did as racist because they don't see race as having really anything to do with color. In fact, the whole idea of being part of whatever minority you're a part of, they believe has nothing to do with the color of your skin, your sex, your orientation, or anything like that. The reason for this idea is due to the interaction of several different theories and modes of thought that have become prominent on the left, the first one being intersectionality. Intersectionality was first coined by Kimberle Crenshaw in her landmark essay, Mapping the Boundaries: Intersectionality, Identity Politics, and Violence Against Women of Color. Crenshaw argued that race and gender were two primary sites for the particular distribution of societal resources, or to put it into plain English, being a woman meant that you faced certain obstacles from society. Being black meant that you faced certain other obstacles in society. And being black and a woman meant that those different obstacles converged or intersected. Just looking at women's oppression or just at black oppression wasn't good enough, because neither approach would actually address the oppression that happened at the convergence of being both black and a woman. Think of blackness and womanness, along with other things like homelessness, sexual minority, and disability, as different categories, different layers that you can add to a person. You can't just see someone as a woman, or just as being black, or just as being disabled. Instead, you can only really fully see, understand, and appreciate someone where those different categories intersect. In a review of the book Intersectionality by Patricia Hill Collins and Surma Bilge for Quillette magazine, Christian Gonzalez explains why intersectionality has become so prominent on the left. And it's because, for the left, intersectionality is not just a way of understanding oppression, but it's a way to actually combat and eventually defeat oppression. And it will ultimately defeat oppression by challenging the status quo, which, according to intersectional's defenders, is inherently unjust. Intersectionality, therefore, according to Gonzalez, quote, critiques all ideas, statements, actions, structures, and institutions that reproduce our society's unequal and repressive systems of domination, unquote. There's also the idea that race is nothing more than a pure social construct. Professor Angela Onwuachi-Willig of the University of Iowa wrote in the New York Times, quote, were race real in the genetic sense, racial classifications for individuals would remain constant across boundaries. Yet a person who could be categorized as black in the United States might be considered white in Brazil or colored in South Africa. She buttressed this by saying that white people in interracial relationships can oftentimes begin to feel less white, either from seeing their SO subjugated to discrimination or from people actually treating them as less white because of who they're dating or who they're married to. And scientists back this up now too, saying that only about 15% of human genetic material varies across the planet. And it's these two ideas which not only got Sullivan fired from Harvard, but which also are causing the most harm to minority people today. First, the idea that race is nothing more than a social construct makes the very idea of racial minorities suspect at the very least. Forget for a moment that race and genetics is a bit more complicated than people are trying to make it out today, and also forget for a moment that the 15% variance in human genetics is actually just an average, and that there is a much higher rate of variance in certain specific areas of human genetics. Forget all about that right now. If race is nothing more than just a social construct, that means anyone could belong to any type of race or ethnicity if they simply felt a certain way or identified a certain way. And that's not me just being a conspiracy theorist. Remember Rachel Dolezal, who is the former leader of the NAACP in Spokane, Washington? In 2015, she was forced to resign from her position after it was discovered that, she's not really black. Like, at all. People, understandably, called her a fraud, and where a normal person would have changed their name and run away to Guam or the Amazon or Antarctica, Dolezal actually defended her choice because, ding ding ding, race is just a social construct. She said, quote, race clearly has a biological element because we have awarded it one, unquote. And if race, or ethnicity, or complexion is just a pure product of history and social conditioning, then what about all the other categories that intersectionality has created? Can you be a homeowner but still be homeless because you feel a sense of camaraderie with the homeless population of LA? Can you wake up one morning and decide that your love of nature actually makes you a dendrosexual, which means that you can take your rightful place at next year's Pride Parade after they add a green stripe to the rainbow flag? And if being part of these minorities just depends on how you identify, on subjective feelings, that means that anyone could become part of any minority or minorities, thereby erasing the entire idea of minorities entirely. Because you can't be a minority, you can't be outside the norm when potentially everyone on the planet could decide to be that minority tomorrow morning. This understanding also shackles minority people into a specific way of thinking. Your color, your sex, your orientation doesn't actually matter for you to be part of a minority, because being part of a category just depends on how you identify. Add to that intersectionality being not only a way to understand oppression, but a way to fight oppression, and that means that if you think contrary to how you're supposed to think as part of a minority, if you think contrary to how intersectionality says that you are supposed to think, then that means that you are no longer fighting oppression, you are no longer the underdog, you are actually one of the oppressors. If you're gay, but you don't think that marriage should be redefined because you think marriage is more than just fluffy bunny equality, that means you're not really gay. You are just someone who wants to see gay people continue to be oppressed, like they said about Paddy Manning over in Ireland. If you're black, but you reject the idea that systematic racism is still a force in play in America today, and instead promote marriage, industry, and prudence as means by which the black community can actually improve itself, like Dr. Thomas Sowell or Candace Owens, then you are a fake black. An Uncle Tom who has sold out his community in order to be part of the powers that be. If you're a woman who supports Donald Trump, maybe because you had a child or a friend who was killed in a hit and run by an illegal alien, then you are not really a woman. You're just an internalized misogynist who wants to see women continue to be oppressed by the patriarchy. And this, not coincidentally, is what happened to Sullivan, because when he accepted to become part of Weinstein's defense team, he became an oppressor because he decided to defend the system which had allowed rich white men to continually abuse women, victims, for decades, putting the system ahead of victims, and in the process scrubbing out his own minority status and therefore allowing Harvard to actually fire him. Being a fully functional adult means that you think for yourself. Now, this doesn't mean that you can't share ideas and beliefs with other people or a group, but it does mean that you're not just supposed to blindly follow and accept an idea, a group, or a trend. Instead, you're supposed to think through an issue or think over an idea to the best of your ability before you decide to either reject it and look for something better or to accept it. By this process, you, in a very real sense, actually make the idea your own. When intersectionality tells people how they have to think or else become oppressors, what they're doing is forbidding people to fully use their rationality and their free will. Intersectionality is effectively making minority people children who can't be trusted outside of the script that they've been handed. This is especially disgusting when you realize that this means that people will be forbidden from actually looking for and finding and holding the truth. And what this leads to is minority people actually being forbidden to create their own core personalities. If all you are is a conglomeration of different categories, then you are not being allowed to create your own core personality. Sure, you're going to be allowed to have your own individual preferences and interests and hobbies, but if you're not allowed to think for yourself, to seek out the truth, then your core beliefs, a large part of what makes us who we are, is going to be dictated to you. Which isn't surprising when you realize that intersectionality only allows you to see yourself as a conglomeration of different minority categories. You're not allowed to see yourself as just a man, as just an individual man, or an individual woman, as the case may be. No, you can only see yourself as a black, female, trans, lesbian. In fact, by intersectionality's inner logic, you only really have existence within these categories. Erase the categories and you erase yourself. This sort of thinking doesn't just destroy individuals, it also destroys communities, which actually is one of the biggest ironies of this whole thing, since intersectionality and race as a social construct were created so that minority communities could actually, supposedly, protect themselves. Think, for example, of a young black man who decides that systematic racism is a thing of the past. It doesn't exist in 21st century America. Chances are his family is going to be torn apart. Because how can a family survive as a unit when one of your own has become an oppressor? And because you can't 100% control what someone thinks, because you can't completely control what they'll read, what they'll see, what they'll hear, what they'll watch, there is always that outside fear, that off chance that your family member, your friend, your spouse is going to end up becoming an oppressor. Intersectionality and race as a social construct were created so that minorities ostensibly could fight oppression. Regardless of the intentions of their creators, these two ideas have failed. Oppression isn't defeated and fortunes aren't improved by a new ideology or a new methodology. Instead, they are only accomplished by looking at the world as it is, as objectively as possible, and then thinking and crafting real-world solutions to those real-world problems. This allows you to actually be people, real individual people, not simply puppets or parrots. It allows you to keep your families and your communities, and to actually work for their improvement. It allows us to actually take the helm and be the captains of our own ship. Well, that about wraps up everything for right now, gang. As always, if you liked the video, whether you agreed with me or not, don't forget to show your support by giving it a like and sharing it with your friends on Facebook, Twitter, and all the other social media platforms. And if you like videos about the culture, politics, and religion, but from a different POV, then don't forget to subscribe to the channel and to ring the bell for notifications, so that you will always know when I post new videos just like this every Tuesday. Videos you're not going to want to miss. As always, thank you for watching, for giving me a little bit of your time. Thank you to everyone who has subscribed to my channel. I appreciate you all. And I will see you again here next week, gang, on top of the stone. Ciao.